In this video, I'm going to go over 6 different ways that you can cut circles out of wood in your shop. I'm going to go over the pros and cons of each method, and at the end, I'm going to tell you which method I think is the very best. Now, there's a lot to cover, so let's get started.
Alright, so the first method I'm going to try is using the table saw, and I've never actually done this one before, so I need to make the jig first. To start, I made a runner out of hardwood to ride in the miter slot. Then I'll cover that with two-sided tape, which is going to help me position the runner on the jig. I also need to go ahead and add some washers into the runner so that it sits proud of the surface of the saw, otherwise the tape is not going to be able to do its job. Then I can just drop a scrap of plywood onto the tape and press. Now I can just lift the jig off the saw and the runner comes with it. After that, I can drill some pilot holes into the jig and secure the runner in place. Now once that's done, I can run the jig across the blade to remove the excess and we are ready to go. To cut a circle on this jig, I need to set the distance from the blade to the pivot point. Basically, however big you want your circle to be, just divide that by 2 and that's where you make your mark. I drilled a 1/4 inch hole into the jig and inserted a 1/4 inch dowel. Now I need to find the center of my workpiece, and to do that, I mark it with a straight edge from corner to corner, and where those lines meet is my center. I then drill a 1/4 inch hole about halfway through the bottom side of my workpiece, and this method does assume that the bottom of the workpiece will never be visible, something like the bottom of a table. Now I can just drop my workpiece onto the pin and check that it's nice and spinny. Okay, so the way this method works is I need to cut corners. No, like literally cut the corners one by one. After I cut the big corners off, I rotate the piece and move on to each new corner, cutting them off as they get smaller and smaller. It's actually pretty cool as I do this to see the circle begin to take form, and at this point I can finish it off by positioning the workpiece right at the cutting edge of the blade and spin it until it's perfectly round.
So this method actually turned out to work surprisingly well. Now, my initial thoughts were that this method was going to be tedious and a little messy and not leave a very clean edge. And while it was slow to cut all those corners one by one, and there is a limitation to the size of the circle that you can make on a jig like this, the edge is what's really impressing me. It's very clean, very smooth, and even though I have an 80-tooth crosscut blade on my table saw, this is much better than what I was expecting out of this method, and this might actually give my favorite way of cutting circles a run for its money.
Okay, moving right along, the next method for cutting circles is actually my favorite, and that's done with a jig at the bandsaw. Now this is my jig, and just like the table saw jig, it has a runner and has holes at different distances from the blade and also a pivot pin. And the jig goes right to the edge of the blade just like it does at the table saw. Once again, I make a hole in the center of my workpiece and drop it onto the pivot pin. Now here's where this method differs from the table saw. With one smooth, nearly effortless motion, I can spin the workpiece and create my circle. Of all the methods for creating circles that I've found, I don't think any of them beat the bandsaw for speed and effort. The one downside to this method is that the bandsaw blade does leave a pretty rough edge. It's nothing that a little sanding can't clean up, but this edge is definitely not nearly as smooth as what just came off the table saw. One question that you may have is, what do I do if I can't put a hole in my workpiece? Well, here's the solve for that. I created a circle with a pivot hole already all the way through it. I then used two-sided tape to stick that circle to my workpiece. I can then just drop that right on the pivot pin of my jig, and I can go ahead and make the cut without needing a hole in my workpiece. The two-sided tape holds really well, and this method requires so little effort that I can control the workpiece with just a couple fingers, so I'm not really putting any pressure or torque on that two-sided tape. This is a great option if you're making cutting boards or other items where you don't want a hole in your workpiece.
So the bandsaw method offers several pros. It's by far the fastest method that I found for cutting circles, and it's pretty effortless to turn the workpiece through the saw blade. It's a pretty clean process, and the bandsaw is a relatively safe tool to use in the shop. Now the bandsaw blade does leave a pretty rough edge that will need some sanding to make it smooth, and of course you do have a cut capacity on this type of jig. Mine goes to 26 inches. If you have a bigger bandsaw, you might be able to do bigger circles. But if you're looking for a bigger circle, the next method might be the one that you want.
That brings us to method number 3, which is probably the most well-known way to cut circles, and that's using a router and a trammel. To make a trammel, I just cut a strip of 1/4-inch Baltic birch ply at the table saw. I then use my router base plate to mark the position of the router at one end of the ply. And on the other end, I make a smaller circle just using a can. Next, I draw 2 lines from the edge of the little circle to the edge of the big circle. Now with the basic outline drawn, I can take this over to the bandsaw and cut out this shape, staying just outside of my lines. Now this doesn't have to be perfect, just close, because I'm going to take this back to the sander and sand everything smooth and clean back to my lines. Now once that's done, I can use the base plate again to mark the center hole and the screw placements. I used a Forstner bit to drill out the center and then drilled the screw holes. And also make sure that you countersink these holes so that the screws sit below the surface of the jig and don't interfere with its operation. And last, I drilled a series of 1/4-inch holes down the center of the jig at 1/2-inch intervals. Now I can fasten the trammel to my router and I'm all set. I went ahead and made a trammel for my small router as well. And I made these little grooves so that I could write the circle diameter for each pivot hole. Now I can just drop the trammel onto my pivot pin like so and plunge a 1/4-inch into my workpiece. At this point I can just spin the trammel and the router and make the cut before I plunge deeper and continue cutting. At this point I could continue plunging and cut my way all the way through the workpiece, but that can be a bit dangerous if you don't have your work and offcuts properly supported, and it can also leave chip out on the opposite edge of the workpiece. What I like to do is finish the cut with a jigsaw, following the path of the trench that I made and staying away from the workpiece as much as possible. This will leave me with a little bit of waste at the bottom to deal with. But I also have a nice smooth reference edge to act as a template for the rest of the cut. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and use a flush trim bit on my router. The bearing of the bit will ride along the smooth edge and flush up the waste. The end result is a perfectly smooth round circle. Okay, so here's my take on the router method. The pros of doing it this way is that you can pretty much make any size circle you need, provided that your trammel is big enough. The trammel on my large router can make up to a 4-foot circle. I can't imagine needing to make anything bigger than that, but I could if I wanted to. Another pro is that this method leaves a pretty clean edge that doesn't require much sanding. Now there are a few cons to this method as well, one of them being that you pretty much have to have a hole in your workpiece. A router is a pretty dangerous tool as it is, and I wouldn't trust operating it if the center was being held in place by 2-sided tape, because you don't have nearly as much control over the tool and the workpiece like you do at the table saw or the bandsaw. Now another con is that this method is pretty tedious. Depending on how thick your workpiece is, you're going to be making multiple revolutions, plunging just a little bit at a time and going pretty slow with that router until you get down deep enough that you can finish off the cut with a jigsaw or a bandsaw. And finally, and this may be the biggest con depending on your point of view, is that this method is by far the messiest. I made one heck of a mess cutting out this tabletop, and it may take me just as long to clean this up as it did to actually cut out the circle.
So what if you don't have a router or you find routers intimidating to use? Well, do you have a jigsaw?
Method number 4 is probably the most cost-effective way to cut out your circles, and to do it, I made another trammel. The only difference between this and the router trammel is that the business end of this one is shaped like a jigsaw base, not round like a router base. And since you can't screw it to the bottom like you can with a router, I need to make a small place for the jigsaw to sit, and I just used some scraps of ply to do that. I just glued these little strips to the trammel, making sure that everything was nice and square and that the jigsaw fit snugly inside. You really don't want to have any play here because you won't get a perfectly round circle if you do. I then went back and fastened them with screws just to make sure that those little pieces never came apart from the trammel in the middle of a cut. Now one final detail is that I marked reference lines to show where the inside edge of the jigsaw blade lines up with the trammel. You can see here that this trammel has a center hole and also pivot points that line up with that hole. Now I will say, to do this method, it is best if you size your workpiece first to the dimension of your finished circle. That way you can just drop the jigsaw in and begin cutting. But if your workpiece is larger than the final circle will be, you're going to have to drill a pilot hole for the blade to have clearance to begin the cut. And just like that, I've got another circle.
So the jigsaw method is a very interesting option. You get the same large cut capacity that you get with the router method, but there are some key differences. A jigsaw is a cheaper and I think less intimidating tool to use, so that makes this method a little more accessible to the beginner woodworker. It's also faster because you're only going around that circle once instead of multiple times like I did with the router, and it was a lot cleaner than using the router as well. Now, the one downside that I found and what you're really going to have to watch out for is what it does to the edge of your circle. I did get a lot of tear out on this method, and that's something that would definitely have to be figured out or corrected if you really cared about how smooth and clean that edge was on your workpiece. But if you can figure that out, I think this is a pretty good method. So what if you already have something that's round, like a Lazy Susan or an end table, and you want to duplicate it?
Method number 5 is cutting a circle using a template and a router. So this one is probably the easiest method because you already have something to reference. Let's pretend that this circle is a cutting board. I'm going to add some two-sided tape to it and stick it firmly to my workpiece. There, that'll do nicely. Next, I'm going to cut away most of the waste using a bandsaw, or you could use a jigsaw, just whatever you have will work here. Just remove the waste, leaving between 1/8 to 1/4 inch of the waste around the template. Then using a flush trim bit, just like I did earlier, the bearing is going to ride along the template and trims the workpiece flush. And just like that, I have an exact copy of my original. Okay, now finally that brings us to method number 6, which is cutting a circle on the CNC. Yeah, I get it. It's expensive, it's a robot, it's not real woodworking, but CNC is becoming more and more commonplace in the age of digital fabrication, and it deserves to be on this list. And for good reason, because if you can get past the expense and the learning curve, it has all the pros that you need for making circles. You can use two-sided tape or hold down so no hole is needed. It's also the safest way to do this because the machine is doing the cutting for you. It leaves super clean edges, and with dust collection, it's not very messy at all. And you can create circles with diameters that are exact down to the 1,000th of an inch. The only real limitation to the size of the circles you can cut out is the capacity of your CNC.
All right, my final thoughts on which methods to use are, if you've got a really large circle to cut out, I would go ahead and stick with the router method. For cut capacity and cleanness of edge, I still think that is the best bet there. Now, if you want a really clean edge right off the tool and the circle doesn't have to be really huge, I would definitely try that table saw method. I was super impressed with how clean that edge was right off the cut. Now, if you need to make circles on a budget, I would go ahead and try the jigsaw method. There was the little issue of chip out that I think can be solved, and if you can get past that, that is a really nice beginner option. But my best and favorite is still the bandsaw method. I think that when it comes to cutting circles easily and quickly and cleanly and safely, the bandsaw method is still the way to go for me.